Have you ever felt pain so deep that you decided to turn that pain into action? Maybe you've never been through a war with guns, bombs, and trenches, but what about that silent war, fought inside, when the world around you goes on as normal, while you try to keep your head up amidst the rubble of your own soul? That pain that doesn't bleed, but burns every day, and that no matter how much time passes, insists on leaving invisible marks. It's about this type of scar that we're going to talk about today. And what you're going to discover now may surprise you. The story I'm going to tell you doesn't begin with hope. It begins with fear, loss, and silence. A silence that echoes louder than any explosion he's ever heard in the field. He was just another soldier returning from war, carrying not only the trauma of what he saw, but mainly the weight of what he felt, or failed to feel. When he returned, the world was no longer the same. But what no one understood is that the real battlefield had begun there, inside him, and there was no uniform that could protect him, nor command that could ease the pain that had set in. For months he struggled with memories that no one could see. He slept little, isolated himself, and often wondered if it was still possible to truly live, or if he was just existing. Until one day, walking down the street, he saw someone with the same look that the mirror insisted on giving him every day. Empty, lost, on the verge of collapse. It was at that moment that something changed. And that's when everything started to make sense. Have you ever been there? Have you ever found yourself trying to help someone just because you knew exactly what they were feeling? Have you ever reached out even though you didn't know what to say, just because you knew that their silence hurt as much as yours? That's exactly when his life took an unexpected turn. It wasn't an easy choice. It wasn't a plan. It was a necessity, an urgency to not let anyone else face that darkness alone. And that's how he, a former soldier who was broken inside, became a volunteer. Not because he had everything sorted out, but because he could no longer bear to see anyone suffer as he had. What was once a silent pain became a living mission. The soldier who had returned broken became a shelter for others. And what he experienced as a volunteer, you need to listen carefully. Stay with me until the end of this story, because every detail carries a truth that can touch you deeply too. Maybe you know someone going through this. Maybe it's you, and maybe, at the end of this journey, you'll discover that there is strength even in the most broken pieces of your heart, because what follows is more than a story of overcoming. It is a reminder that some wars are only won when we transform pain into purpose, and that is exactly what he decided to do. And that was exactly what he decided to do. Transform his own pain into a bridge to reach those who had also thought about giving up. But what he perhaps didn't imagine is that, by reaching out, he was also slowly rescuing himself. Every story he heard, every tear he wiped away, every look he met along the way, all of this was slowly stitching together the parts of him that seemed lost. Volunteering wasn't a complete cure, but it was the beginning of a new life with meaning. And maybe, listening to this now, you are remembering something you have already experienced, or someone you love who is carrying a similar pain. Maybe you have never talked about it with anyone. Or maybe you are feeling exactly what this ex-soldier felt, that the pain seems too big to fit inside your chest. If this subject resonates with you, leave here in the comments what touched you the most so far. Your story matters. Your pain is also real. And when you share it, in addition to relieving some of this weight, you can be exactly what someone needs to read today, to not feel so alone. Oh, and if this type of content makes you think, feel, and see life in a different way, don't forget to like the video. This really helps the channel to continue bringing stories like this, which not only inform, but also welcome. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who, like you, need to hear that they are not alone on this journey. And of course, if you want to continue walking with us, listening to real stories of people who went through invisible battles and decided to start over, subscribe to the channel. Here, each video is a reminder that pain doesn't have to be the end of the line. It can, in fact, be the beginning of something transformative. Because what happened next? Oh, what happened next will show you that even scars can blossom when we choose not to hide them anymore. The war ended on paper. The newspapers announced it. The weapons were collected, the bodies were buried. And yet inside him, everything remained in combat. There were no more shots crossing the sky, but there were noises that only he could hear. Noises that came from within, like shrapnel scattered between his chest and his memory. Sleeping became a challenge. The night, which had previously been a refuge, became hostile territory, and there was no trench that could protect him from his thoughts. Because the war, the real one, the one that doesn't appear in the headlines, continued inside him even when everything around him was at peace. It's hard to explain to someone who's never been there, to someone who's never smelled the fear embedded in their skin, or seen the last hope fading in someone's eyes. But the hardest part was not being able to switch off. Their bodies were at home. Their minds were still in the field. Every louder sound, every moving shadow, was a trigger. The simple slam of a door made their hearts race as if someone had shouted, "Attack!" And the worst part of it all was that no one could see it, because the blood had stopped flowing. But the wound, that was still open, invisible, but alive. He walked the streets like someone carrying a secret too heavy to share, and that's exactly what many people around him do too. They carry pain that no one notices, scars that aren't on their skin but shape the way they walk, talk, react. He tried to ignore it, tried to be strong, tried to move on with his life. But there were days when getting out of bed was already a battle won, days when the silence screamed louder than any bomb, and the world seemed too small to hold so many memories, as if everything was out of place, including him. At times, he even began to doubt whether he was still part of this world, because while everyone else seemed to be moving forward, he was stuck in a timeline that repeated itself. It was like living in two worlds at once, the present before his eyes and the past pulsing behind his eyelids. And no one knew about it. No one suspected that this seemingly normal man, sitting on a park bench or waiting for the bus, was inside, silently imploding. The external war had a date, but the internal one, that seemed to have no end. And it was precisely in this void that the idea of volunteering began to emerge, not as a noble plan, nor as a clear mission, but as a silent cry for help. Perhaps by helping others he could help himself. Perhaps by listening to the pain of others, he could silence his own a little. It wasn't about charity. It was about survival, about finding meaning where before there was only darkness, because there are pains that we can't explain, but we can recognize in others. The first few times were difficult. Being in front of someone who was also suffering was like looking in a mirror, like reliving scenes he was trying to forget. But at the same time, something inside him began to change. Empathy became a bridge. Acceptance became a cure. And the pain, which had previously been just a burden, began to have a new purpose. He understood that he didn't need to be completely well to do good. He didn't need to have all the answers to offer a listening ear. All he had to do was be there, present, human, real. In this process, he realized a hidden truth. Many people don't need advice, they need presence. They need to know that someone understands, that someone has already been through something similar and didn't give up. And that in itself has a huge impact. Because when we connect through what hurt, a type of bond is born that goes beyond words, a type of trust that transforms. That's how, little by little, he began to rebuild his own identity, not as a hero, not as a survivor, but as someone on a journey, someone who decided not to let his pain be in vain. And that kind of decision changes everything. It changes the way we see the world, how we react, how we position ourselves. It even changes the way we breathe. Because when you understand that what hurt you can be a tool to lift someone else up, something inside you awakens. A strength that doesn't come from the absence of pain, but from the choice not to be defined by it. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Comment here, that makes sense to me. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because every great transformation begins with something seemingly simple. A look, a scene. An encounter that on the outside may seem ordinary, but on the inside changes everything. He didn't plan that moment. He simply left the house, as he did from time to time, trying to escape his own thoughts. He walked without a specific destination, as if his steps were a way to numb his mind, to postpone memories. And it was on one of those aimless walks that destiny decided to act. It was a cloudy afternoon, the kind that seems to match what we feel inside when words fail to convey it. He stopped in front of a bakery not because he was hungry, but because he needed a break. And there, leaning against one of the side walls, was a young man, apparently silent, but with his eyes screaming. It was impossible not to notice. An empty, lost, heavy look, a look he knew all too well. It was like looking into a broken mirror. Each piece reflected a part of his own story. At that moment, everything inside him froze. The world around him faded into the background. Because that look carried the same density, the same type of pain, the same despair that he felt on his most difficult days. It was an unexplained, unnamed pain, but one that is recognized in the other as an invisible whisper. I know what you're going through. He didn't know the guy's name. He didn't know what had brought him there, but he knew with absolute certainty that this young man was on the verge of something, and that perhaps a gesture, a presence, a word, could make all the difference. He hesitated. He wanted to leave, to pretend he hadn't seen it. After all, he himself still carried open wounds. What could you offer someone if you could barely help yourself? But then a hidden truth struck him like a bolt of lightning. What if I had met someone on that worst day of mine? What if, in that moment when I almost gave up, someone had stopped for me? It was this question that burned inside him like a flame that was hard to ignore. So even without knowing exactly what to do, he approached. He sat down nearby, respecting the silence. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't give any advice. He just stood there, and little by little the young man's gaze changed. It didn't turn into relief nor happiness, but it was no longer the same. It was as if the simple fact of not being alone at that moment created a crack in the wall of pain that surrounded him. And in that crack, something new began to be born. That moment, small to the world, was immense within him. It was the first time he felt that his pain could have a purpose, that everything he had experienced, no matter how hard it had been, could now become a shelter for someone. He realized the real impact of a decision, because yes, everything starts with a choice. The choice to not turn away, to not let things go by, to reach out, even in pieces. And that was exactly where his journey as a volunteer began, not in institutions, not with medals, but with empathy, pure and simple. That first meeting was not the only one. After that, others came. People of all kinds with stories that carried the same weight of invisibility. People wounded by life, by losses, by internal wars. Each one of them activated something in him. It was not pity. It was identification. It was like reliving his own emotional background in other voices and other faces. But now with a difference. He was no longer just a spectator. He was present, choosing to participate in the healing, even without having all the answers. And this began to create a profound shift in his mindset. Before, everything had been about survival, about getting through another day. Now, it was beginning to be about meaning, about contribution, about how a life marked by pain could still have a positive impact on the world. And this idea, this new perception, began to guide him differently. It was no longer just about feeling less pain. It was about using it as fuel for something bigger, as if the past had finally found a purpose in the present. And do you know what's even more curious? Most of the people he helped didn't even know that he was also in the process of healing, that every conversation, every listening, every gesture was a silent exchange where both left more whole. Because deep down, all true help is a two-way street. When we offer presence, we also become stronger. When we welcome, we are also welcomed. He didn't suddenly become a different person. The triggers were still there. The emptiness still appeared from time to time. But something fundamental had changed. He no longer felt alone within himself. He no longer saw himself as a burden, but as someone on a journey. And this is one of the greatest revelations that pain can offer. When we decide to stop hiding, life begins to respond in a different way. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because behind every change there is a specific moment when everything could have gone the other way. A decisive moment, often silent, when the soul is placed against the wall. And it was no different for him. There was an invisible fork in the road inside him where the choices were clear, even if the path was still shrouded in doubt. Either he would sink into his own emptiness, or he would become the outstretched hand that he had sought so many times and could not find. And this decision, although it was made in the silence of his room, became the turning point in his existence. That day he was exhausted, not physically but emotionally drained, as if every thought were a weight, every memory a stone. And there in the dark, lying down and staring at the ceiling, he felt what many have felt, but don't always have the courage to say out loud, that maybe it would be easier to give up, not because he wasn't strong, but because living that way seemed to have no meaning at all. And it was precisely this pain that brought out something unexpected, a small spark, an uncomfortable question. What if I use all of this to stop someone from getting to where I am now? This simple and raw idea hit like a light in the darkness. It wasn't comforting. It didn't bring immediate relief, but it did bring direction. And when someone finds direction in the midst of chaos, something starts to reorganize inside. He realized that, even without having all the answers, he could be useful. That even if he was afraid, he could move. That even if his chest was broken, he could still embrace. And this thought became a decision. He would no longer be just a survivor. He would be a presence. He would be a bridge. But deciding is just the first step. The second, and perhaps the most challenging, is to take action. Leave the house, expose yourself, go through the discomfort. The fear of not being enough still accompanied him. The fear of appearing weak, of not being able to truly help, of reliving old pains. All of this walked with him. But along with it came something new. The awareness that doing something, even if imperfect, was infinitely better than doing nothing. It all started small. A conversation with a neighbor who was also a former soldier. A coffee with an old colleague from the battalion. A gesture of listening during a community meeting. No one knew that behind that firm gaze was a heart still being rebuilt. But it was precisely this contrast that made everything have an impact. He didn't speak like an expert. He spoke like someone who understood, who had been there, who knew what it was like to look at one's own monsters and move forward, even while trembling inside. And that created something powerful. Because people don't want ready-made advice, they want truth. And truth is what he carried, in his words, in his silences, in his reactions. By allowing himself to be seen, he also allowed others to see themselves. By showing that he still felt fear, he gave others permission to admit their fear as well. It was an invisible but profound exchange. A connection that grew out of the mutual recognition of wounds. This choice, to no longer hide behind a facade of strength, was liberating. For the first time, he no longer had to pretend he was okay. He no longer had to smile to keep up appearances. He could be whole, even if incomplete. And that kind of authenticity in a world so full of masks has immense value. He was no longer a soldier trying to adapt to civilian life. He was a man on a mission different from the one that had brought him to the front, but just as challenging, helping others find their true selves. It was during this period that he realized something essential, that pain, when ignored, makes you sick, but when listened to and accepted, it transforms. And this transformation is not immediate, it is not linear. It is made up of timid steps, of falls, of new beginnings. It is a process, not a miracle, but it is a possible process. And he was living it, one day at a time. The behind the scenes of this decision were not pretty. There were anxiety attacks, memories that came back abruptly, moments of silence that seemed eternal. But they also had discoveries. Revelations about himself that he would never have made if he had not gone through the pain. And one of them was clear. No matter how much he had suffered, he could still choose. He still had that power. And deciding to help someone was, in a way, rescuing himself in every gesture. This change in mindset affected everything around him. The way he related to others changed. Conversations became more profound. Meetings with other people were no longer just social, but bridges of real connection. He began to realize that there are many people shouting on the inside but smiling on the outside. And this generated in him a type of attention that few have. He listened beyond words, saw beyond expressions. It was also during this phase that he understood the value of silence. Because sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is not a solution, but a safe space to exist. And that is what he began to offer. A space where pain was welcomed, not judged. Where crying was understood, not interrupted. Where fragility was not a sign of weakness, but of humanity. All of this was born from that dark night, from that decision between sinking or acting. And that's why he never underestimates anyone's pain. Because he knows what it's like to be on the brink. You know what it's like to look into the abyss and think it's over. And he also knows that all it takes is one choice for everything to start changing. A choice that may seem small but carries within it the power to start a new journey. The journey of someone who, despite being marked by war, decides to live with purpose. Comment here. I chose to act. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because making the decision to act is a milestone, but putting that decision into practice with all the insecurities and doubts it brings is what really tests someone's strength. And for him, this transition between intention and action was one of the most challenging moments of the journey, because when you come from an environment where pain taught you to survive in silence, making yourself available to others in a genuine way, it's like relearning to live with an open heart, vulnerable, real. He didn't know exactly what to do. He had no course, no diploma, no structured emotional preparation. He only had empathy. And as unlikely as it may seem, that was enough to get started, because when someone is willing to listen without rushing, without judgment, they are already doing more than most people. And he decided to start like that, by listening, by being present, not trying to fix anything but simply by being there. At first everything seemed awkward. The words didn't come out the way he wanted. Sometimes the silence was awkward. Other times the emotions came so strong that he had to take a deep breath to keep from breaking down. But something inside him told him that this was the right path, and he followed it, even though he stumbled, even though he thought that maybe he wasn't helping as much as he would have liked, because he knew what it was like to be on the other side, and just the fact that someone was there, for real, made a difference. He began attending small support groups. He observed more than he spoke. Each story he heard brought back a piece of his own. They were men and women who also carried invisible scars. Some spoke openly. Others were still afraid to expose themselves. But all of them, without exception, carried a burden. And somehow he became a safe place. A listening point. A silent support that, little by little, was becoming essential. It wasn't uncommon for him to come home emotionally drained. There were days when he wondered if he was really helping someone, or just reliving his own pain. But all it took was a look of gratitude, a tight hug, or a tearful phrase. Thank you for listening to me. For him to know he was on the right path. Volunteering wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. It was about filling spaces that were often too empty for those who no longer believed that anyone could really care. And in the process, he also began to reconnect with parts of himself that he had left behind. He began to see a purpose in old pain, not as an excuse but as a tool. He told himself, if I went through all that, at least let it serve so that no one else has to go through it alone. This was his hidden truth, the flame that kept him going even on days when everything seemed too hard. Of course, there were moments of doubt, moments when he questioned his own limits. He knew he couldn't carry the world on his shoulders, and that wasn't his intention. But learning to balance self-giving and self-care was an essential part of his transformation. He realized that helping didn't mean nullifying himself, but aligning himself with something greater. It meant serving with balance, with awareness, with humanity. One of the most beautiful things about this process was discovering that many people didn't want advice. They wanted to be listened to. They wanted to have space to say, I'm not okay, without receiving an immediate cure formula. And he knew exactly how much that hurt, because how many times had he been interrupted by people saying, you need to be strong, this will pass, or think positive. He learned that presence heals more than words, that a look that says, I'm here, can save someone from an abyss. And even with all the setbacks, the uncertainties, the desire to back down some days, he kept going, because he could no longer unsee what he saw. He could no longer pretend not to recognize the pain in the eyes of others. It was as if life had given him a different lens. Now he could see what many ignored, and this became a silent responsibility, but a profoundly transformative one. Over time, he began to notice small signs of progress, not only in the people he helped, but also within himself. Anxiety no longer gripped him as strongly. The memories of the war still came back, but now they had a place to stay, a context, a reason. He understood that it wasn't about forgetting what he had experienced, but about giving new meaning to those experiences. And that required courage, a lot of courage, but it also brought relief. His journey as a volunteer did not make him immune to pain, but it made him more aware of the power that exists in listening, in empathy, in choosing to be helpful even when one is still learning to heal. And in this constant movement of giving and receiving, he discovered a new identity, no longer as a victim of war, but as an instrument of peace, as someone who decided to break the cycle of pain through acceptance. Write it down. Empathy was my beginning. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it was in this new setting, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and fragile voices, that he began to realize how much each story he heard was, in fact, an extension of his own. He didn't know the names of everyone who arrived. He didn't know their pasts, but all it took was a look, a pause in the middle of a sentence, a hesitant gesture with his hands, to understand that this suffering spoke the same language as the pain he carried inside. And this created something difficult to explain but easy to feel, a silent and true connection. These encounters gradually became mirrors. Some were painful, others were revealing. And in many of them, he saw himself there, not as a volunteer who was there to support, but as someone who still needed to be understood, A woman who had lost her son in an accident, a man who carried trauma from prison, a young man who had survived abuse and was never the same again. They hadn't been through the war like he had, but they had all faced equally devastating battles. Pain changes its name, but not its intensity. In each conversation, something inside him was touched, sometimes with tenderness, sometimes with brutality, but always with truth. He learned that listening to someone talk about their nightmares also made him face his own, and instead of running away, he decided to stay, to sit, take a deep breath, and welcome what emerged. It wasn't easy. There were days when he wanted to retreat, to be silent, to close himself off again, but there was something stronger, the awareness that that shared moment could be the only ray of hope that person would have that week. There was one man in particular. His name was Benicio. He was a veteran of a forgotten war, which many no longer studied in history books. He didn't talk much, but one day, after many silent meetings, he began to open up about his past, and as he spoke, he realized he was hearing his own story, told by someone else. The fears, the guilt, the losses, the long nights when he wakes up sweating with his heart racing, reliving scenes that should no longer exist. That had a profound effect on him, but unlike what he feared, that didn't destabilize him. Curiously, the effect was the opposite. It was as if, by seeing his own pain existing in someone else's body, he finally realized that he was no longer trapped in it, that somehow, he had already taken a few steps forward, that now, by listening without sinking, by welcoming without getting lost, he was also rebuilding himself, and this revelation went through him with force. Every hug he gave was a healing for him too. Other stories came with the same power. A young woman named Letitia, for example, arrived at the group without saying a word. Her face had that look of someone who had lived longer than her age would allow. She had survived an abusive relationship and spent months blaming herself for not having left sooner. When she finally found the courage to speak, her voice was shaking, and he, listening, felt that tremor in his own chest, because he also knew what it was like to feel trapped by something that destroys you, but at the same time confuses you. When she finished speaking, he didn't say much. He just held her hand and said, "You survived, and that's already a lot." She cried for long minutes, and he cried with her inside, because every word he said to her, he said to himself too. These encounters didn't just heal him, they reshaped him, because it wasn't just about repeating gestures of support, but about understanding that he was part of a network much larger than his own story, a network of wounded people who, instead of hiding their scars, chose to use them as a way of recognizing others along the way. It was a kind of brotherhood of pain, where no one needed to prove anything, just exist sincerely. And this began to shape his outlook on life. He began to see value where before he had seen only flaws. He began to see beauty in people who dared to continue even after everything. The shy smile of someone who had previously been unable to lift their face. The softer look in the eyes of someone who, for the first time, felt heard. The transformation was not loud, but it was real, and he witnessed it as someone who, without realizing it, was also being transformed. This exchange, so subtle and yet so powerful, created a kind of silent ritual within him. Every time someone finished telling a painful part of their life, he felt a part of himself also being released. As if, by holding the other person's pain, he was giving permission for his own pain to slowly go away. It was almost as if each encounter was a letter of emotional freedom, for the speaker, and for him as well. Of course, not all stories had happy endings. Some were still in the midst of chaos. Others ended with the person walking away without looking back, and that affected him. But he learned to respect each person's time. Not everyone wants help. Not everyone is ready to heal. And that's okay. His role wasn't to fix anyone. It was just to be there, available, real, committed to the truth of that moment. And that, in itself, was revolutionary. This phase brought important revelations. He realized that pain does not need to be denied in order to be overcome. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to continue, even when trembling. That there is a profound wisdom in allowing oneself to be affected by the stories of others, because it is in this affection that the bond resides, the kind of bond that does not depend on pretty words, but on sincere presence. And it was in this terrain, made of scars and listening, that he began to build a new way of existing. Comment here. To cure is also to be cured. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because there comes a time in the journey when pain stops being just something that hurts and starts to become part of your identity, not like a prison, but like a path. And that's exactly what started to happen to him. For a long time, he just survived. He woke up because he needed to. He breathed because his body was still responding. He kept going because stopping seemed more dangerous than continuing. But everything was mechanical, automatic, almost lifeless. Until, almost without realizing it, something inside him started to reorganize itself. And it was through others. Their scarred faces, their trembling voices, their hands that shook as they told their stories, that he realized he was no longer the same. The transformation didn't come in a flash. It came slowly, like a light that grows as we walk. He, who for so long was just someone trying to get through another day, began to become a kind of guide for those who were beginning to walk the same path back to themselves. He didn't place himself above anyone. He didn't speak as a master or a savior. He spoke as someone who knew exactly what it meant to have the ground ripped out from under one's feet. And for that very reason, he was respected. He was listened to. The encounters that had previously shaken him now strengthened him. He could still feel, but he was no longer swallowed up by his emotions. He learned to recognize triggers and turn them into bridges. He began to develop a sensitivity that went beyond words. He knew when someone was smiling just to cover it up. He knew when silence carried more weight than a confession. And more than that, he learned that he didn't need to have all the answers. What people needed most was someone to stay with, even if they didn't understand everything. It was at this point that he realized a truth that he would carry with him forever. When I helped heal someone else's pain, part of mine began to heal. It wasn't just a pretty phrase. It was something he experienced, firsthand, every day. With each word he heard, with each story he heard, one of his wounds healed a little more. Not because it disappeared, but because it stopped being the center of everything. When he took his focus off his own pain and started to embrace the pain of others, his inner space was reorganized. It gave way to compassion, listening, and presence. And that, in itself, was healing. He was no longer the same man who had returned from the war. Now his scars had a voice. His story was no longer just his. It was a tool. It was a testimony. It was a guide. And this new identity was not born of perfection, but of vulnerability, of the courage to continue even when everything said it would be easier to give up. He understood that there was power in surrender, that by making himself available, even in pieces, something new was built with each encounter. People started to seek him out not only to vent, but to understand how he managed to be there, strong, after everything he had been through. And he never romanticized his journey. He never said it was easy. He always spoke of the truth, of the process, of time, of the pain that still appeared on certain days, but that no longer dominated him. He spoke of the importance of being surrounded by real people, of knowing how to ask for help, of accepting that some wounds take time, and that that's okay. The journey is not a straight line. It has curves, stops, descents, but there is a path, and that is already a long way. This change of place, from survivor to guide, also changed the way he viewed his own past. Before, memories of the war came as hauntings. Now they came as reminders of what he had overcome. It still hurt, but it no longer destroyed. It still weighed on him, but it no longer paralyzed him. He began to look at himself with more compassion, and this change in mindset was essential to keeping the flame that drove him alive, because now he knew that his strength did not come from the absence of pain, but from the choice to use it consciously. This was reflected in the details, in the way he listened, in the time he dedicated to each person, in the respect with which he treated each story. He never made comparisons. He never diminished what the other person felt. He knew that suffering has no exact measurement, and that often, a wrong word can distance more than an honest silence. That is why his way of guiding was not through speech. It was through example, through constancy, through presence. He showed that it was possible to continue even when broken, that it was possible to help even when you were not ready, that, in truth, no one is completely ready, and that beauty lies precisely in that. Over time, the impact he was making began to be felt more widely. People changed after talking to him. They left feeling lighter, more awake. Some came back. Others took his message further. It was as if an invisible network of care was forming, and he was one of its roots. And though he never asked for recognition, he knew he was doing something that mattered. Not to the whole world, but to someone. And that was enough. It's funny how life takes turns, isn't it? He who had felt lost for so long was now a compass for those who arrived in pieces. And yet he maintained the humility of someone who knows that he is also still learning. Because guiding is not about having all the answers. It's about walking together, being willing to listen. To fall, get up, and keep going. It's about remembering every day that the journey of healing is not a finish line. It's a constant decision, a commitment to one's own truth and to the truth of others. Write it down. My pain has purpose. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is something powerful that happens when someone who has suffered a fall decides not only to get up, but also to reach out to lift someone else up. And that was exactly where he found himself, rebuilding his own life while helping others get back up. It was like walking over rubble day after day, finding there, amid the mess, the dust, the leftovers, little pieces that still worked. And by offering them to others, he was also putting together something new inside himself. It wasn't like in the movies. The pain didn't go away. The longing for days that seemed lighter still loomed in the corners of his mind. Nightmares sometimes insisted on returning, but what had once been a senseless burden now gained a new perspective. The pain, although present, was no longer the same. Now it walked beside him like a living memory, not to imprison him, but to remind him that he had survived, that he was still here, that everything that seemed like an end was turning into a new beginning, a silent new beginning, built with real gestures. And it was at this point in his journey that he understood something he had perhaps never realized before, that rebuilding one's life does not mean erasing the past, but integrating it in a different way. Before, he wanted to forget. Today, he chose to remember, not with bitterness but with purpose. Every pain he had experienced carried within it a trace of strength, even if he had not realized it at the time. And it was this strength, not shaped by ready-made speeches but by real falls, that he now put at the service of others. The mission became fuel. On days when he woke up feeling unmotivated, without direction, he just had to remember someone who had touched him with their words, with their listening, with their simple presence. He just had to remember the look in someone's eyes who left a conversation seeing the world a little more lightly. That moved him. That kept him going. And even without knowing exactly where all this would lead, he kept going. One step at a time. One heart at a time. There was a time when he was walking down the street and recognized a young man he had helped months earlier. The young man saw him from afar, smiled, and said, "That conversation changed the way I breathe." And he didn't know what to say. He just smiled back. But inside, something opened up. Because this was it. He wasn't saving the world. He wasn't changing thousands of lives at once. But he was touching people one at a time. And that quiet impact away from the headlines was what sustained the mission that now pulsed within him. Rebuilding yourself while helping others rebuild themselves requires a different kind of strength. It is not the kind of strength that shouts, that imposes itself, that appears. It is a discreet strength, born of the daily choice not to back down, to continue offering even when there is still a lack, to remain vulnerable, knowing that the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, is the only possible path. And he had chosen this path, not out of heroism, but out of conscience. And over time, he realized that he was indeed changing. Not because the pain disappeared, but because its meaning changed. It was no longer something that defined him, but something that drove him. And that changed everything. The way he spoke to others, the way he walked down the street, the way he looked at the world. He stopped seeing himself as a victim of what he had experienced. He began to recognize himself as someone who was alive for a reason, someone who still had something to offer, even when he thought he had nothing left. The behind the scenes of this transformation was far from perfect. There were setbacks, cloudy days, moments when he wondered if it all made sense. But it was precisely at these times that he returned to the essentials, to the face of the person he had helped, to the hug he received without asking, to the tear that fell from a stranger and that he had the honor of welcoming. It was these seemingly small details that reminded him that he was on the right path. He never romanticized the process. He knew that rebuilding a life after pain was a labor of love. It required patience, humility, and time. But he also knew that beauty was not in the perfection of the result, but in the intention to continue, in the decision not to harden, to not let suffering turn him into someone cold, bitter, or distant. On the contrary, he chose to remain sensitive. He chose to continue feeling even though he knew that sometimes it hurts. And this choice made him even stronger, because true strength is not about shielding. It is about being consciously exposed. It is about being available even when you are afraid. It is about sitting next to someone and saying, "I've been there too. And look, today I'm here with you." This doesn't require titles. It doesn't require a resume. It only requires truth. And that's what he carried. A truth that was lived, felt, and experienced. And for that very reason, powerful. This new outlook on life began to affect even the little things. The way he walked down the street, the way he greeted someone in line at the grocery store, the way he looked at his own reflection in the mirror. The transformation was no longer just internal. It was in his gestures, in his care, in the intention with which he did things. Because when pain becomes purpose, even everyday life becomes filled with meaning. And so he went on, sometimes in silence, sometimes in tears, but always with his heart open, day after day rebuilding his own story, not as someone who had overcome everything, but as someone who had decided not to hide anymore, someone who understands, in practice, that living is often an act of courage, and that guiding others is also a way of staying strong, of constantly reminding yourself of who you are when you decide not to give up. Comment here. My mission keeps me going. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is something that can no longer be ignored, and perhaps that is precisely why you are still here, listening to all of this until now. There is a pain that does not scream, that does not bleed, that does not attract attention, a pain that walks inside us silently, disguised in everyday gestures, in the automatic smile, in the ready answer of, "Everything is fine," when inside, nothing is. It is this silent, almost invisible pain that makes us sick the most, because it does not ask for help from the outside, but cries out for a way out from the inside. And if this touches you in any way, perhaps it is your soul saying, the time has come to transform what hurt you into something that heals, not only others, but also yourself. He knows exactly what it's like, living without living, waking up out of obligation, carrying your body as if it were a suit of armor that was too heavy, laughing at social gatherings and then crying in the dark of your room, and most of all pretending that everything is under control when, in reality, you can barely breathe inside. He's been there, and it was there, on the brink of collapse, that a hidden truth began to form. Maybe, just maybe, the pain hadn't come to destroy him, but to lead him to something greater. Of course, this doesn't make everything easy. There are still days when emptiness hits, days when the memory of everything that was lost hits hard. But now he can't run away from it anymore. He learned to use what he feels, not as an excuse, but as a compass. Pain became a map, a flawed map, with unknown paths, but which points to something much deeper, meaning. Because when we understand that we can transform what hurt us into a tool to build bridges with others, the weight starts to change. The pain is still there, yes, but it becomes useful, and that makes all the difference. If you feel like you can't take it anymore, that everything seems too heavy, maybe it's not the end. Maybe it's the exact moment when your pain is offering you a key, not a ready-made solution, but a path. Because, as contradictory as it may seem, some of the strongest people you've ever met are those who once thought about giving up and chose to stay. They chose to transform. They chose to use their own wound as an instrument of empathy. And maybe it's that same decision that's being placed before you today. He didn't get where he is without fighting himself. He had to relearn the basics. Trust, breathe calmly, accept help. He had to look himself in the mirror and say, even while shaking, "I'm still here." Because only those who have felt the taste of giving up know how valuable it is to keep going. And keeping going doesn't mean following a straight line. It means stumbling, retreating, changing course, but not letting go completely of your own hand. It means resisting the urge to extinguish yourself and instead lighting a candle in the dark, even if that candle is small, even if it only illuminates a hand's breadth ahead. It's hard to explain, but there's a kind of strength that's born only when everything breaks down, when the facade falls, when the mask no longer fits, when the pain becomes too great to hide. That's where the silent warriors, the wounded caregivers, the soul volunteers are born. People who don't have all the answers, but have something even more powerful. Presence. The ability to look someone in the eye and say, "I don't know everything, but I understand. I'm here." And if you've come this far with this weight on your chest, thinking that no one could understand, maybe this is your confirmation. There is someone who understands, who has been through this, who has gone through the same storm, who still feels the cold winds of memory but who has learned to walk anyway, someone who discovered that their greatest pain could also be their greatest point of contact with other lives. And maybe, just maybe, this is also available to you now. No matter how much you've hidden it, no matter how long you've spent pretending everything was fine, there's always time to stop and look inside yourself with truth. Because only when we face what hurts do we begin to have power over it. And this power isn't about erasing the past, but about using it as a foundation for something new, something lighter, more human, more real. And you don't need to know exactly how to do this right now. You just need to accept the idea that it's possible. He learned that while he was trying to heal others, he was actually accessing inner layers that he would never have reached on his own. It was as if each story he heard touched a forgotten place in his heart, a place that no longer hurt in the same way, but that still needed to be cared for. This constant exchange between giving and receiving, welcoming and being welcomed, became a cycle of healing, and the more he allowed himself to be a channel, the more he realized that he was, at the same time, a recipient, a listening channel, a container of learning. Maybe you are still trying to understand if this is for you. Maybe you doubt your ability to help someone when you are like this, broken, without energy, without hope. But the truth is that you don't need to be ready. You just need to be available. And this availability, even if silent, is already an act of courage. It is already a step. It is already a movement. Because often the ones who help the most are not the ones who have the answers, but the ones who have an open heart. And you already have that. Even if you are afraid, even if you are in pain. So if this pain is still there inside, maybe it's not to punish you. Maybe it's showing you the way back to yourself. And maybe along the way you'll find other people who need exactly what you have. Not your perfection, but your presence, your listening, your sincere gaze. Because no one heals another with a manual. They heal with truth. They heal with presence. They heal with humanity. And you already carry that. Even if you don't know it yet, write it down. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there comes a time when pain stops being just a scar and becomes a seed that, if well cared for, can grow, blossom, and even provide shelter for others. It's not about erasing what happened, nor about pretending it didn't hurt. It's about looking at everything that marked you and asking sincerely, what can I do with this now? This question, simple in form, but profound in impact, can open paths you never imagined you would take. Because deep down, what really transforms pain into strength is not time. It's the decision you make with it in your hands. He learned this in everyday life, not in theories, in uncomfortable silences, in conversations with people who no longer believed in anything, in looks that said, I can't take it anymore before the words were even out. And most importantly, he learned by observing himself. By observing how pain, when accepted with courage, began to dissolve and give way to something new, not immediately, not magically, but with constancy, with presence, with humility to accept that the process requires surrender, and that each step towards healing is also an act of faith. It was on this terrain, fertile and painful at the same time, that he began to build something that no trauma had been able to take away from him: meaning, purpose, path. He understood that he didn't need a stage, titles, or fame to make an impact, that sometimes the greatest revolution happens when you choose to get up and take someone else who has also fallen with you. And that helping is not about saving the other person, but about walking together, recognizing that we are all trying to survive in some way. The truth is that there are many people right now who are going through what you may have been through, or are still going through. People who are silent, their hearts broken, trying to look good on the outside while they are begging for relief on the inside. And maybe, without realizing it, you have been that person. Or maybe you are becoming someone who can be a presence for them. Someone who doesn't need to know everything but who knows how to listen. Someone who has learned, even in pain, that reaching out is just as powerful as receiving help. He looked back and saw that the pain had not been in vain. That every difficult night, every crisis, every moment he thought he could not bear it, had built something inside him. Not something perfect, not something immune to sadness, but something strong, flexible, capable of understanding without judging. He did not choose what happened to him, but he chose what to do with it. He chose to transform. He chose to serve. He chose to walk. And this choice, although simple, changed everything. It changed his look. It changed his gestures. It changed the place from which he spoke to the world. Now his words carried life, his silences carried listening, and his pain carried purpose. And even though there were still difficult days, there was a kind of certainty inside him that could not be explained, only felt, I'm on the right track. And that's ultimately what it's all about. Walking in truth, even without guarantees. If you feel that something inside you has moved when you hear all this, maybe it's because there's a part of you that's ready for this next step. Maybe your pain, the one that seemed like just a shadow, is about to turn into light for someone. Maybe you don't know how or where or with whom yet, but just the fact that you're considering this already says a lot. It says that you're still alive, and that there's a force inside you that's greater than everything that's tried to stop you up until now. So instead of continuing to fight against pain, maybe it's time to look at it with different eyes, to ask a new question. What if I use all of this to make a difference? Because the world doesn't need more perfection. The world needs more real people, whole in their imperfection, willing to not waste what they've lived. And maybe, just maybe, this is your moment to turn the key. You don't have to wait for a big sign. The sign could be this conversation. It could be that discomfort in your chest. It could be that thought that won't shut up. What if I can also help someone, even if I'm not completely well? The answer lies within you. And no matter how difficult the path has been to get here, what you do with it now will define the next chapters. Because in the end, pain is only worth it if it teaches us to love better, to serve with more empathy, to listen with more patience, to live with more intention. He never thought he would become this kind of person. But today, as he looks around and sees the impact that a simple listening can have, he understands. Healing was never just about him. It was always about what could come of it, about what could blossom from the moment he chose not to waste what he had lived. And maybe this is also his opportunity to rewrite his own story, not by denying what hurt him, but by transforming it into something that makes sense, that generates life, that welcomes. Because in the end, it's not about pretending the pain didn't exist. It's about making it worth it, about looking back and being able to say with conviction, I didn't choose the pain, but I chose what to do with it. What about you? What are you going to do with yours? Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to some part of you. Maybe it was a passage, a phrase, a memory, but something kept you going until the end. And that, in itself, says a lot. So if this content made you think, feel, or see something in a different way, subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about things that almost no one talks about, but that everyone feels. And if you want to show me that you stayed until the end, write in the comments, I'm with you until the end. It will be good to know that this message found someone on the other side. Oh, and if this video really touched you, leave a like, not only because it helps the channel, but because it also shows that we are building a real connection here, a conversation that makes sense. There is a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. The journey is just beginning.